Get off the array! That's not background radiation! Move! The shout cracked through Europa Station's maintenance ring a second before the forward console exploded. Sparks bit into skin, panels warped inward. Engineer Dren Halvik staggered back, his visor flashing red across every quadrant of his helmet's display. They'd picked up a whisper, an anomalous pulse hidden behind Europa's fallback signal chain, but it hadn't been natural, it was tracking. Inside Europa Control Deck 3, operators scrambled, fingers raced across ice-chilled keys, their breath sharp in the recycled air. The data stream had shifted patterns, subtle but wrong. The ping intervals showed intelligence, someone was listening. The realization didn't come from a warning light, it came from the operator whose hands had been steady through 2 asteroid strikes and a partial hull breach. When he backed away from the array without saying a word, people followed. By the time the Europa fallback signal finished transmitting to Earth, the Drazari had already completed trajectory mapping. From a sovereign Dominion surveillance ship stationed far beyond Saturn's rim, the signal profile was enough. Decay rates, power interruptions, heat map irregularities. No need for espionage. Earth's critical infrastructure had degraded in real time. Dominion military doctrine required no debate. Humanity's resource chain had overreached. Its orbital economy was disjointed. There was no coordinated command across the outer settlements, no active planetary defense net. The Dominion tagged Earth as a Tier 4 clearance candidate. There would be no envoy, no staged diplomacy. Tier 4 classifications were not competitors. They were systemic risks. And Dominion policy handled such risks with fleet sterilization. Within 6 standard cycles, the strike orders were coded, stacked, and authorized. Dominion carrier wings launched from the DIS, arc side of Kepler Theta 9, their approach folded between gravitational windows calculated months in advance. They didn't rush, they aligned. Earth's skies brightened just past 0430 UTC, not with light, but with burn paths. Low-orbit satellites blinked out before the atmosphere even registered the kinetic signatures. Surveillance stations along the Pacific equatorial ring reported full systems freeze just before losing power. No thermal bloom, no audible impact, but screens turned black. Data towers in Jakarta fried their own backups, trying to reroute through non-existent relays. By the time lunar colonies attempted to respond, their uplinks had been severed mid-transmission. Entire towers went dark, with no final logs. Inside Earth Command's orbital monitoring hub beneath the Andes, an emergency operator shouted across the main chamber, "We've lost polar relays, full blackout, northern string just vanished." His voice cracked, not from panic, but from disbelief. It had happened without sound, without fire, without a single intercepted warning. Communications Director Rilt Thorne stepped to the central dais, eyes locked to a laser array flickering across the room's circular projection dome. "Cross-check with Neptune Gate," he ordered. No response. Just static bleed. When the main orbital AI failed to initialize its tethered response sequence, Earth Command triggered its last surviving contingency, protocol lockdown. A safeguard born from the Cold War but updated in fragments over decades, it was designed not to retaliate, but to prevent internal chaos. Every nuclear platform instantly isolated, every strategic satellite ordered to stand down, autonomous drone fleets across Eurasia redirected to internal standby zones. Even non-military AI cores received immediate isolation orders. Not a single missile fired, not one defense cannon turned. Lockdown didn't activate firepower, it cut the lines to it. Humanity, once terrified of its own capacity to annihilate, had built a fail-safe that stopped itself from reacting out of fear. Now, that very system left it inert. Marek was underground when the blackout began. 100 meters beneath Greenland's frozen shelf, the lights in his lab dimmed in syncopated intervals before stabilizing under emergency grid command. His name didn't flash on alerts, he didn't receive orders, but he felt it. Dr. Halvan Marek had spent 7 years arguing against humanity's slow disarmament in favor of containment protocols. He knew the signs. Systems weren't dying, they were being sealed. Civilian networks collapsed by the hour. Atmospheric bounce signals dropped until mobile towers stopped repeating. Transports grounded mid-flight. Global news feeds went mute. An old radio engineer in Alberta described it best in a recorded note left on a cassette. Everything's working. Everything's dead. On Titan, a maintenance rig called T-Drift 29 drifted off its anchored track after failing to sync with orbital corrections. Its crew, 4 engineers and 1 cargo pilot, had no idea that Earth had stopped answering not out of damage, but because it couldn't allow itself to scream. Above, Earth's sky no longer shimmered with the layered glints of artificial orbital shells. The light was gone, but the planet remained untouched. No city had been bombed, no military base targeted, but every node that made Earth a participant in its solar network had been methodically shut, as if someone had drawn the blinds on a house before erasing the wiring inside. Inside the strategic communications chamber, buried beneath Geneva's older foundation levels, Councillor Merrick Alstan stood silently over the terminal interface. He had once warned that the outer colonies would lead Earth to collapse, not from invasion, but from exposure. Now, he watched a blue dot fade from the corner of his heads-up display, the last ping from the moon's primary relay. No explosion, no thermal trail, just the fading of data, like breath on cold glass. He didn't speak until the chamber's illumination dimmed again and stayed low. "They're not here to talk," he said to no one in particular. "They're here to disconnect us before we remember how to scream." Across continents, people stood in open streets, staring upward. There were no sirens, nothing visible in the clouds, but somewhere inside the silence, instinct whispered what machines could not. Something was watching, and it had no interest in being seen. On the final functional sub-oceanic relay, an AI named Relay 12 executed its last unbroken cycle. It was programmed to log civilian emergency broadcasts and submit error correction data every 9 seconds. When Earth's command authority failed to respond for 6 full intervals, Relay 12 didn't panic. It did what it was programmed to do in the absence of confirmation. It sealed itself permanently and transmitted the global signal that activated fallback archives. No one saw the message. No one had to. The planet remained. So did the people. But the voice of Earth, its digital presence, its shared thought, was gone. Silenced, not through destruction, but through surgical disconnection. And somewhere beyond the last orbital wreckage, hidden behind the quiet line where Earth's atmosphere thinned into gravitational drift, Drazari command vessels watched the stillness and wrote in their reports, "Target civilization rendered inert. No resistance encountered. Proceed with sterilization sweep protocol." They believed Earth was finished. Earth, however, had just stopped listening. "Authorization Alpha Vox 4, reactivate hollow point." The words left Councillor Alstan's mouth without ceremony, but in the reinforced vault beneath the Andes, the atmosphere changed. The air in the room thickened, not with fear, but finality. He didn't look at the others. He didn't need to. They had already watched the sky fall in silence. Across the Atlantic, buried under frost-cracked basalt and carbon-anchored security layers, Dr. Halvan Marek was pulled from classified isolation before the sun touched Greenland's ice. He hadn't spoken to another human in 41 days. The knock at the blast door was rhythmic. 3 taps, then 1. Not protocol, a pattern from an older life. When the chamber opened, the man standing there wore no insignia. He offered no rank, only a data wafer and 4 words. "They've triggered protocol lockdown." Marek didn't ask why. He didn't need to. The moment the wafer met the scanner embedded into the cold slab of the desk, the reinforced walls responded. A magnetic clamp hissed loose beneath the floor. The chamber realigned itself vertically. He was being sent up. Inside the aerial transfer pod, Marek adjusted the cuffs of his thermal jacket. His eyes scanned the transparent storage block, now rising through the ceiling, a cylinder filled with cooling rods and inertial compensators that once powered deep-bore research. They had been sealed 5 years ago, banned under the Interplanetary Regulation Charter for reasons most still didn't understand. He did. He built the reason. Hollow point had never been a weapon in the traditional sense. It didn't produce shockwaves or detonations. It didn't tear through steel or vaporize command decks. It induced collapse, targeted spatial drift, forced into realignment. At full scale, it could nullify momentum itself. The early models destabilized every drone in test orbit. The final prototype inverted a jump craft mid-transfer and stranded it in overlapping gravitational states. The pilot never reappeared. That's why they buried it. Not because it didn't work, but because it did. Sub-Orbit 9 wasn't on any navigational chart. Suspended above the South Pacific, held inside a synthetic gravity trench, it functioned off-grid. No broadcast, no AI tether. Its access required 3 dead keys, 2 of which had been destroyed. Marek held the third. When the drop shuttle docked, Marek stepped into silence. The corridor was lined with kinetic armor, not for protection, but containment. It took 13 steps to reach the central command core. He took each with a weight that pressed heavier than his boots. Inside the chamber, laser plasma displays came alive, not by touch, but by confirmation signature. Marek's vitals activated the dormant systems. They scanned his pulse, temperature, neural patterns. The core accepted him. Then it opened the vault. The schematics were waiting. Layered and indexed across the vertical axis of the chamber wall, the display cycled through iterations of HoloPoint, version 2.1 through the aborted 4.6. Marek didn't select a version. He bypassed protocol and called for the raw schema, the unstable prototype that had triggered the Accord suspension. The display responded with a warning overlay in blood-red script. Field unsafe. Non-stabilized. Use requires override. He didn't blink. Override accepted, the system confirmed in its mechanical dialect. Then the lights dimmed as auxiliary power routed through deep core pathways. Martian ring stations, reclassified for agricultural orbital balance, began redirecting their inertial harvest toward Earth's fallback systems. Lunar batteries were tapped simultaneously. Marek felt it through his boots. The core was pulling power Earth hadn't used since the Jupiter relay crisis. He stepped forward. The deployment bay opened. Unlike conventional silos, HoloPoint wasn't launched. It was seeded, initiated from stabilized altitude, then inverted across harmonic layers. The targeting matrix wasn't designed to destroy. It was meant to intersect phase-shift corridors, exactly the method Drazari fleets used to stay untraceable between jumps. He expanded the Dominion jump maps on the auxiliary grid. Earth intelligence had compiled the Drazari transit intervals before the blackout. Marek had only theory to work from, no updated telemetry. But if the enemy was still using standard pathing between compression zones, he knew exactly where they'd be next. They always tracked toward vector equilibrium before triggering the next burst. And that made them traceable, not by where they were, but by where they had to realign. Marek opened the safety regulator protocols. One by one, he disabled the failsafes, the containment coils that limited residual gravitational bleed, the harmonic dampeners that kept fallback tremors from disrupting local orbit, the fallback reset that stopped a second pulse from being triggered manually. Each vanished from the screen with a chime that echoed like a quiet resignation. This wasn't about survivability, it was about control. And control now meant imbalance. He reached the final prompt. Confirm deployment parameters. Unregulated, irreversible, non-stabilized field inversion. His hand hovered over the panel. Then, slowly, he pressed his palm to the display. A burst of static crawled across the projection. The system didn't protest. It simply began assembling the cascade matrix. The floor vibrated, not violently, but deep, as if gravity itself had shifted half a degree to the left. Marek reached for the side rail and steadied himself. His fingertips twitched with the memory of the first test run, a decade ago, in a lab that no longer existed. He remembered the expression of the junior technician when the drone collapsed mid-flight and reversed its own motion path before disintegrating. A new warning flashed across the core panel. Predictive error, margin exceeds 83%. Deployment will compromise adjacent low-orbit shells. Marek tilted his head. Then they'd better not be there. He stepped back. The matrix bloom had started. It wouldn't fire like a missile. It would roll through space like a tide that couldn't be outrun. A net, not a blade. He looked up at the command tier, where layered projections traced overlapping paths of jump lanes and orbital debris. Each streak glowed brighter as power routed to interception zones. The Drazari wouldn't see it coming. Not because Earth had outgunned them, but because they'd never imagined anyone would attempt to kill motion itself. Marek's hand lowered. His breath misted against the chilled air of the chamber. Behind him, red schematics cycled with active warnings, some flickering as energy loads exceeded predicted safety margins. He didn't look back. The weapon he built wasn't meant to end a war. It was designed to remind the enemy that speed meant nothing when the ground shifted beneath your strategy. And Earth, for the first time in a generation, had stopped trying to survive. It had chosen to halt. Scatter pattern now. I want atmospheric dive trails in all quadrants. Make it look like we're running for cover. Commander Joral's voice cut through the comm grid as Earth's remaining fleet fanned out across the equatorial line. The sky above the Indian Ocean was filled with fire arcs, every ship throttling in different vectors, discharge trails crisscrossing at high angles. One corvette twisted so sharply through re-entry that its outer fins sheared from the heat, tumbling into the clouds below. It didn't matter. This wasn't about cohesion. It was theater. In the command bay of the Sable Vow, Joral stood in front of the heads-up display, one palm flat against the tactical glass, eyes locked on the red-marked Drazari intercept zones. The enemy hadn't adjusted formation since the blackout. That was key. They believed Earth was done reacting. Every broadcast Earth didn't make further cemented that assumption. Send another burn pulse eastward, staggered flare, triple echo. I want their sensors seeing a fragmentation spiral. Joral turned to his tactical second. Make us look broken. 36 Drazari vessels formed a net across geosynchronous altitude, phase shift carriers nested between drone swarms and kinetic cruisers. From the central control deck of Hazak Prime, Fleetmaster Zhor Khan reviewed the latest playback of Earth fleet movements. He observed erratic burns, drift deviations, overlapping atmospheric signatures. None of them fit coordinated withdrawal patterns. His command officers offered no challenges. In Dominion War doctrine, asymmetric retreat without counteroffensive typically indicated terminal fracture. The Terrans had lost coherence. Strategy collapsed. Commit 3 destroyers for orbital sweep, Zhor Khan ordered calmly. Push them beneath atmospheric edge. Remove any remaining defense clusters. The Drazari destroyers accelerated. Gravity shielding flickered along their hulls as they dropped into the thermal layer, skimming just above Earth's densest cloud barrier. One descended fast enough to vaporize moisture layers across 100 kilometers, carving a spiral into the cloud floor. Below them, coastal cities still flickered with passive grid activity. Power was on, but no defense towers came online, no kinetic counters fired. It was too quiet. Aboard Suborbit 9, Marek leaned forward. The first stage of the hollow point sequence had completed its harmonic anchor phase. The Bloom core now hung, suspended in stasis, waiting for the activation pulse. His fingers twitched as the final convergence matrix built itself. Dozens of variables shimmered across the laser plasma display, each representing one phase point in Earth's orbital band. He spoke once, voice even. Deploying now. The shift began without spectacle. No arc, no beam, no sound. In the orbital shell above the equator, something bent. Destroyer Raisin Toll was the first to register loss of equilibrium. Its inertia matrix flagged a gravity loopback. Then, in less than a second, its internal phase core inverted. The bridge split apart, not through rupture, but through drift. Every reinforced segment that anchored it in real space alignment began sliding away from its own mass center. The ship's frame sagged mid-jump. Within seconds, 17 Dominion vessels experienced simultaneous harmonic failure. Onboard navigation logs froze. Jump drives retracted without anchor points. Engines disengaged. And then the impossible. mass without movement. Some ships stilled entirely. Others hung mid-transition, edges ghosting between space-time layers like glass trapped between two mirrors. One phased cruiser stopped rotating and simply locked in orientation, an impossible feat without catastrophic counterforce. Its own crew compartments began tearing from within, gravity trying to resolve direction. From the sable bow, Commander Jorrell saw the shimmer cascade. He didn't cheer. He stepped forward, hands still, eyes scanning. Confirmation? A comms officer answered slowly. Enemy ships. They're not exploding. They're folding in on themselves. There's no heat signature, no thrust trail. They're just stuck. Back aboard Harzak Prime, Zorkan stood unmoving. His screens pulsed with error overlays. Internal AI threads tried to recalculate navigation across jump space, but the margins kept widening. Too many inputs failed to resolve. The Dominion fleet's adaptive tech relied on seamless transit. Their infrastructure had no precedent for nullified movement. Zorkan's subcommanders waited for a directive. Instead, they received silence. Then came the second pulse. It rolled laterally, targeting the Drazari outer perimeter arrays. Those weren't warships. They were long-range staging beacons used for sync calibration and return vectors. Without them, retreat trajectories became guesswork. Marek had programmed this wave to follow non-vessel signatures. When it struck, the arrays blinked out, one by one, leaving only residual interference and rotational scatter. At suborbit 9, an audible crack split the internal plating as gravitic overload distorted the chamber floor. Marek adjusted the anchor modulation manually, stabilizing it before fault lines could ripple upward. His eyes stayed on the screen. The third wave was loaded. All it required was a confirmation ping. He raised his hand, paused. Behind him, the chamber echoed with the residual tremor of atmospheric distortion. He watched the targeting map. Dozens of enemy ships, immobile, phase-locked, unable to flee. None fired, none advanced. The battle, if it could be called that, had ended without combustion. He turned away from the launch key. The third strike wasn't necessary. Cancel remaining wave, he ordered flatly. We made our point. Silence answered. System compliance. No resistance. In orbit, Dominion vessels remained suspended like carcasses caught mid-migration. Some still blinked through failed jump cycles, internal engines stuck in loop. Others displayed open hull tears, their crews likely trapped in directional uncertainty, unable to move forward, backward, or eject. On Earth's surface, crowds emerged cautiously. Satellite feeds were down, but low-range optical lenses captured static images of frozen ships hanging in the upper sky. People stared without understanding the method, but they understood the outcome. The sky had broken. Commander Jorrell exhaled through his teeth. We didn't kill them. No, said his tactical second, checking the last feed. We made them irrelevant. Marek sat down alone in suborbit 9's control chair. The displays around him still flashed layered error codes. Gravity fields weren't meant to be warped like this. Space-time was resilient, but it remembered damage. He didn't look proud. He looked tired, as if every line of code he had written now weighed twice its logical value. He didn't speak again, not even when Earth Command finally called in. He simply watched the flicker of a fleet that once moved faster than thought, now held in place by a planet they had never thought to fear. Fleetmaster, the command buffer failed again. Drive systems won't acknowledge a fixed anchor. We can't calculate a jump. The Drazari officer's voice fractured halfway through the sentence, filtered through damaged relays. Inside the operations deck of Harzak Prime, air trembled slightly from the ambient distortion cascading through the ship's structural field. Gravity felt uneven. One step to the right made the floor feel lighter. The next step pulled harder than it should. No one commented anymore. They all knew what had happened. They simply hadn't accepted it. Fleetmaster Zorkan stood alone before the central display, a cylinder of rotating vectors locked in disarray. Every attempt to reinitialize the primary navigation AI had failed. Multiple vessels reported static field collapse around phase cores, and those who hadn't already been frozen mid-transition were spiraling in calculations with no destination to align to. He could hear the panic in his officers' silence, not in their words, but in what they were no longer willing to say. He pressed his command seal into the console, waited for acknowledgement, and opened a universal outbound signal. "This is Zorkan of Dominion Fleet Cell 94A. Ceasefire requested. Repeat, Dominion requests immediate ceasefire and strategic containment negotiation." The message pulsed across spectrum layers, bounced between fallback beacons, and hung inside the gravitic haze Earth had left in orbit. He spoke clearly, but the weight behind each word left the air thinner after they passed. Never before had a Drazari fleetmaster issued a ceasefire without terms, never with his voice shaking. Back on Earth, the signal arrived inside the Council's blackout relay. A technician caught the ping mid-cycle and flagged it with a red mark on the heads-up feed. Councillor Alstan walked into the chamber 10 seconds later, still buttoning his coat. "Source?" he asked. "Direct from their flagship. Their command channel's been forced into open relay. They're done hiding under encrypted bounce." The technician leaned forward, hesitated. "He's asking for negotiations, sir. No demands, no terms." Alstan gave no outward reaction. Instead, he activated the embedded switch near the base of the console. It had remained untouched since the Cold War archives were transitioned to subterranean command. Its activation reopened a broadcast loop Earth hadn't used in 73 years, Sub-Channel 0. The transmission that followed wasn't angry, it wasn't dramatic. A diplomat named Vay Lauren, grey-templed, quiet-spoken, known mostly for lunar water treaties, appeared calmly in front of the transmission node. "This is Earth. We acknowledge your signal." He paused, gaze unflinching. "Our terms are immediate orbital demilitarization, permanent withdrawal beyond Saturn's ring, and recognition of all Terran sovereign transport corridors." He offered no smile, no rhetoric. His tone was equal parts formality and warning. Behind him, the projection showed frozen Dominion vessels still hanging in Earth's lower orbit, like cracked glass ornaments. The message required no elaboration. The image said, everything. Inside Harzak Prime, Zorkan turned away from the console. He didn't answer, he didn't protest. He stood for a moment still inside a chamber that no longer offered control. Then he looked to his second. "Transmit acceptance." The Dominion didn't issue a press release. They didn't retaliate. Instead, their classification protocols were quietly updated. Earth was now Tier 1 containment. Not a military threat, not a tactical rival, a variable too dangerous to analyze without consequence. Above Earth, frozen warships remained adrift, locked in gravitational confusion. Some would remain trapped in orbital drift for years. Others might never be recovered. Dominion salvage crafts began slow approach maneuvers, unarmed, flagged with white band non-combat tags. They did not enter Earth's inner shell. No ship crossed the invisible line drawn by Hollowpoint's shadow. In the command suite of Suborbit 9, Marek received 3 separate encrypted requests from Earth Command. Each offered a debrief appointment, each extended accolades. He ignored them. He sat alone in the observation bay, the displays around him still jittering with residual gravitational interference. Gravity wasn't stable here. That was the cost of using the weapon unregulated. Chairs leaned slightly to one side. Fluid in the dispenser tanks rippled on their own. Instruments read small irregular pulses every few seconds. Reality wasn't fully settled yet. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt something harder to name, like standing at the edge of a machine that still moved, even though the gears had all stopped turning. When he finally stood, he spoke into the console once. "Releasing command seal, transfer all authority to civilian oversight, I'm done." The system accepted his voice print, then it shut down. At ground level, civilians gathered on rooftops and open fields. With the blackout still active and mainstream channels throttled, information moved person to person. Photographs taken with analog lenses showed impossible silhouettes overhead. Ships hung in arcs, not by choice, but because the sky itself wouldn't let them fall or flee. Some children pointed, some adults cried, not from fear, from something older. Along the Baltic coast, a teacher named Han Vesik walked his students to the shoreline. They brought field scopes, unsure what they'd see. What they found was a vessel frozen with its hull warped into static rings, light shimmering oddly across its fractured form. One of the students asked if it was alive. "No," Vesik answered slowly. "It just forgot how to move." And in that moment, the world understood. This wasn't victory in the traditional sense. It wasn't conquest. There had been no parade, no slogans. Earth hadn't destroyed anything. It had rewritten the boundaries of how force could be applied. The real power had never been Hollow Point's yield. It had been the silence afterward, the stillness that followed. The fleet wasn't broken, it was quieted. And that quiet didn't end when the weapons powered down. It settled into the air, into the posture of diplomats who no longer shouted, into the posture of children who now looked up and didn't flinch. Earth hadn't retaliated. It had made retaliation obsolete. And in every Drazari command hall across the outer arm, analysts ran simulations through corrupted models, trying to find the moment their calculus failed. They never did, because the final move hadn't been plotted. It had been refused. "Did you hear it?" The question came from a boy on a rooftop in Ankara, pointing skyward with a flashlight gripped like a flare. His mother stood behind him, one hand steady on his shoulder, gaze fixed on the still shape above the city. What was once a Drazari corvette, now bent across its axis, frozen in orbital drift. It didn't cast a shadow. The clouds had moved around it, and still, it hung there. "Nothing makes that stop," the boy whispered again. "It's still up there." In neighborhoods across every continent, families gathered after sunset, blankets laid on rooftops, balcony chairs repositioned, old binoculars dusted off and shared. They didn't speak much. Some brought candles. Others left food on the windowsills as if preparing for someone to return. The sky hadn't turned red, it hadn't cracked open, but it had changed, and Earth had felt that change through its bones. Above Reykjavik, observatories reopened their domes not for tracking stars, but to monitor gravitational instability reports. The telescopes remained motionless for hours, focused not on deep space, but on the objects visibly hanging over Earth's exosphere. They hadn't moved in days. No orbit adjustment, no spin drift. The satellites nearest to them reported slight shifts in vector readings, enough to misalign entire navigation networks. Guidance systems for planes over the southern hemisphere had to be manually recalibrated. Oceanic drones were grounding themselves from misreading planetary curvature. Something in the sky had warped Earth's relationship with movement. At an underground press session in Geneva, reporters were granted 10 minutes with Dr. Halvan Marek. He entered wearing the same deep grey coat from Suborbit 9, collar unbuttoned, posture rigid. The room smelled of recycled air and paper ink. Only one camera was authorized. When the interviewer asked what it felt like to be the man who saved the planet, Marek didn't look up. "I didn't save anything," he said. "I deployed a tool designed to end directional agency. That's not heroism. That's a last calculation when all other equations fail." The interviewer blinked. "But you gave Earth a chance?" "No," Marek interrupted quietly. "I removed the enemy's ability to decide. There's a difference." When asked to elaborate, he sat back in the chair, eyes low. It wasn't a weapon of power. It was a weapon of terrified logic. His voice didn't rise. His hands didn't move. He wasn't delivering a warning, he was diagnosing a symptom, and the room absorbed it with a quiet weight no follow-up question could cut through. In Melbourne, the Coastal Archive vaults held a broadcast from an orbital pilot who survived partial phase entrapment. His voice cracked repeatedly during the transmission, not from emotion, but from spatial feedback still fracturing his internal equilibrium. He described the experience of losing inertia while still inside his ship, of hearing the navigation AI repeat coordinates that no longer mapped to stable mass. His limbs had floated inside the hull without lifting. His breath had pressed against the inside of his lungs without rising. When asked what saved him, he answered, "It didn't. I just wasn't close enough." His statement was entered into the International Ethics Archive the same day Marek's post-mission review was sealed. Along Earth's equatorial belt, orbital observatories became makeshift memorials. Tourists didn't arrive with cameras, they came with objects, items that meant motion. Old watches, broken compasses, worn-out running shoes. Someone left a single wheelbarrow tire with a note taped to the inner rim, "For what we still can't roll past." The items weren't collected, they were left in rows beneath viewing domes like forgotten offerings at a silent shrine. In the days following the ceasefire, international leadership convened to debate post-Hollow Point doctrine. The conference chamber in Reykjavik filled with conflicting impulses, gratitude versus hesitation, reverence colliding with unease. Some leaders called for a formal ban on field inversion technology altogether. Others demanded exclusive ownership of the system under joint Terry and supervision. A few wanted to build a second unit for deterrence, they said. The room never reached consensus. Every vote was split, not because they disagreed on the danger, but because they couldn't agree on whether Earth was now safer or simply more frightening. Gravimetric researchers reported irregular anomalies in regions surrounding Suborbit 9's deployment path. Birds in certain migration corridors altered flight patterns, turning away from invisible disturbances in mid-air. Deep ocean sensor drones near the Pacific Convergence Zone recorded vertical pull shifts, subtle, rhythmic, and unending. The weapon had ended its pulse sequence, but something beneath the event horizon remained unfinished. Motion could be halted. Reversing that halt remained uncharted. Marek never re-entered public service. He declined every panel, ignored every request for institutional consultation, refused medals or titles. His last public remark came in an off-record transmission intercepted by a junior archivist and later authenticated through voice print. "I built something that doesn't care if you understand it. It doesn't punish. It doesn't warn. It only removes your ability to continue, and that's why we should never build it again." Despite the statement, candles continued appearing at relay towers. Children traced chalk outlines of orbital ships on sidewalks. A retired engineer in Madrid constructed a scale model of the Dominion fleet using bent copper wire and suspended it from her ceiling. It didn't move. That was the point. Earth didn't celebrate. It adjusted. And above every city that once feared fire from the stars, the sky now held a different kind of threat. The memory of what had been stopped, not by anger, not by brute retaliation, but by the withdrawal of kinetic privilege. Motion was no longer a guarantee. And in the stillness left behind, Earth learned to listen again. Vote passes 283 to 31. The accord holds. The chamber fell still, not from surprise, but from the weight of knowing what had just been restrained. The gravitic accord, drafted in a single sleepless week after the orbital freeze, had been ratified with overwhelming majority. Its core clause was simple. Hollow Point-class technology could never be used again without unanimous planetary approval from every signatory member state and off-world territory, not even in war, not even if attacked first. If humanity wanted to be remembered for something other than the day it froze another civilization's fleet mid-jump, it needed laws built for memory, not momentum. High above, Earth's new orbital ring completed its first full rotation since reconfiguration. What once housed weapon arrays and outdated communication platforms now anchored something else entirely, an arc of unpowered buoy towers. Each one floated along the original Hollow Point deployment path, inert, silent, and deliberately difficult to ignore. The towers didn't transmit anything. They didn't scan or monitor or track. They simply existed, anchored with distortion coils calibrated to emit gravitational noise at the same frequency Marek's matrix had once used, not enough to trigger collapse, but enough to echo it. The Drazari, true to their classification protocols, never came back. Their entire strategic doctrine had shifted in response to Earth's silence. Human space was redrawn on their stellar maps, not with borders, but with gradients of risk. Entire sectors were grayed out, tagged with the phrase, "Kinetic Compromised Zone, Interaction Discouraged." Drazari scouts, once common near Saturn's orbit, had vanished. Supply ships from Allied systems reported Drazari vessels now rerouting entire convoys to avoid Terran gravitational corridors. It wasn't fear of human aggression, it was the cost of misreading movement again. At the center of the ring, just beneath Observation Node 7, a nameplate had been bolted to the lower hull by hand. Not by order, not by policy. By the technicians who'd survived the orbital disintegration sequence, who'd watched phase-jump vessels lock in place like insects caught in resin. The plaque read simply, Halvan Marek, and beneath it, 5 words cut deep into the alloy, inertia is the final deterrent. Marek himself never attended the ring's completion. He declined the invitation, along with every other ceremony since the ceasefire. He'd moved to the northern frontier, where magnetic interference disrupted long-range comms and satellite coverage remained unreliable. There, in a one-level shelter made of pressure-treated polymer and reclaimed lunar composite, he grew quiet vegetables and tracked star noise with a handheld receiver he refused to replace. People came looking for him, reporters, students, analysts. He never answered the door. The wind did most of the talking. When a military ethics council requested his appearance for a symposium on deterrence theory, he sent a single-line reply, "I've already spoken with what I built. I have nothing left to say." And he didn't. Others spoke instead. At Terran Command's Strategic Academy, cadets now studied the orbital freeze not as a war story, but as a case file on limits. The weapon wasn't taught as a miracle, it was dissected as a mistake that worked. Diagrams of the gravitic bloom, phase distortion patterns, and harmonic fractures were pored over, not with pride, but with apprehension. No cadet smiled when shown the footage of Drazari ships hanging above the equator, inert and half-translucent. One instructor described it best. "We made a new kind of silence, and now we live inside it." On Earth's surface, the observatories built into canyon ridges and mountain caps became centers for remembrance, not in the way wars are remembered, with bronze statues and folded flags. Instead, they hosted memory tables, flat slabs of ceramic where visitors could leave anything that symbolized pause. A stopped watch, a weathered compass. A child once left a model rocket snapped in two. Another placed an old vinyl record labeled Silence Track 08, Gravity Drift. No one played it. That wasn't the point. 1 year to the day after the fleet collapse, a memorial shuttle lifted from the equatorial pad near Nairobi. It carried 6 passengers, students mostly, on their first orbital assignment. The youngest, a cadet named Ilan Drever, sat alone at the aft viewport. He hadn't been born when the blackout began. He'd only heard stories, most of them whispered, some never finished. As the shuttle passed over the Pacific Arc, he looked up. Outside the viewport, the sky held its shape like a frozen thought. Ships still hung there, some Drazari, some Earth-built, all of them rendered obsolete by what had been done. Ilan didn't speak. His breath fogged the viewport for a moment, and then he pressed his fingertips to the cold glass. Below them, Earth continued moving, but above, nothing changed. The instructor leaned over quietly. "What do you see?" The cadet responded without turning. "What happens when you make the thing that stops everything else?" The answer didn't come from the instructor. It didn't come at all. Earth had changed its doctrine, not by expanding, not by escalating. It had stopped expanding entirely. Colonies were built closer, trade lanes consolidated, probes launched with gravimetric anchors hard-coded into their frames, redundancy on redundancy, so nothing could drift the way Dominion ships had. Humans hadn't become more powerful. They had become more consequential. And as history shifted around that singular moment, the day movement itself became a choice, something deeper settled into Earth's identity. They were not the fastest, not the most advanced, not the oldest species to reach upward. But they were the only ones to show that speed, unchecked, could be punished by stillness. And in the final archival log of the Terran Defense Council's review of the conflict, a phrase was submitted, not as propaganda, not as boast, but as data tag to close the report. They believed Earth was doomed. We didn't need to win, we just had to make them stop. What would you have done if you held the trigger to a weapon that could stop motion itself? Would you pull it, or let the galaxy keep moving unchecked? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Would you choose control or restraint? If you enjoyed this, hit that subscribe button for more thrilling HFY stories. Stay sharp, stay human.